Something unusual is happening in North America, and most people are not paying attention yet. On the surface, it looks like another trade fight, another round of tariffs, another political standoff between Washington and Ottawa. But under that noise, a much bigger shift is quietly taking shape. A shift that could change how Canada deals with the United States for decades to come. This story does not begin with a trade agreement. It does not begin with a tariff announcement. It begins with timing pressure and a miscalculation that few in Washington saw coming. While political chaos was building south of the border, Canada was preparing something very different. Not loud, not emotional, calculated, patient. By mid-2026, the numbers were already speaking. Public confidence in the White House was falling fast. Approval ratings were sliding. Economic promises were not landing the way voters were told they would. And for the first time, there was no previous administration left to blame. In Washington, the focus was on survival. Midterm elections were creeping closer. Party unity was starting to crack. Every decision was being filtered through political risk. In Ottawa, the focus was somewhere else entirely. Canada was not reacting. Canada was positioning. Many analysts expected Canada to walk into upcoming trade reviews on the defensive. They assumed pressure would work. They assumed higher tariffs would force quick concessions. They assumed Canada would do what it had done before, negotiate from fear. That assumption turned out to be wrong. When tariffs were raised again, some of the highest in modern trade history, the expected panic never came. Instead of rushing to Washington, Canada quietly started opening doors elsewhere. Europe, the Indo-Pacific, new supply routes, new buyers, new long-term plans. And while the headlines stayed focused on tariff percentages and political speeches, something more important was happening behind the scenes. Canadian dependence on the US market was slowly, deliberately being reduced. This was not accidental, it was strategic. At Dylan News, we look beyond surface drama, and when you zoom out, a clear pattern starts to form. Every time pressure increased, diversification accelerated. Every threat triggered preparation, not surrender. Every attempt to corner Canada pushed it further away from economic dependence. This did not mean there was no cost. There was damage. There was strain. Some industries felt it immediately, but the system did not collapse. Companies adapted, supply chains shifted, exports found new paths, and something else changed too: public opinion. As tariffs stayed in place and uncertainty dragged on, Canadians began rethinking what economic security really meant. Short-term comfort started to matter less than long-term control. The idea of economic independence, once abstract, became practical. By early 2026, that shift was visible in polling, in business behavior, and in government budgeting. Money was being committed, infrastructure was being planned. Markets outside North America were no longer side options, they were priorities. This is where timing becomes critical. A mandatory trade review was approaching, one that could either lock in stability for years or open the door to constant renegotiation and pressure. Most observers thought this review would favor Washington. After all, the US market was still massive. Leverage looked one-sided, but leverage depends on more than size. It depends on political strength, and that strength was weakening. As the review date approached, the White House was facing declining trust, internal party friction, and growing voter frustration over prices, wages, and trade outcomes. Threats that once carried weight started sounding familiar, even tired. Meanwhile, Canada had done something rare in modern politics. It planned for instability instead of hoping it would go away. Rather than betting on election outcomes in another country, Canada assumed the pressure would continue regardless of who won or lost, and it built accordingly. This is what many in Washington failed to understand. The strategy was no longer about winning a single negotiation, it was about changing the balance so that future negotiations hurt less. By the time formal talks were set to begin, Canada was not walking in empty-handed. It was walking in with alternatives. That alone changes everything. Because when a country can wait, threats lose power. When businesses have other markets, deadlines stop being fatal. When public support favors firmness, political fear disappears. The coming months would test this strategy, not just at the negotiating table, but in elections, markets, and public patience. And what happens next will not just decide trade terms. It will decide whether North America continues as a system of dependency or shifts towards something more balanced. This was never just about tariffs. It was about control, timing, and who blinks first. And the real surprise is Canada never rushed to blink at all. The formal review process did not arrive quietly. By July 2026, every major economy in North America knew what was at stake. This was not a routine check-in. This was a moment that could reset trade rules for the next generation. On paper, the structure looked neutral. All parties had options: renew the agreement long-term, walk away entirely, or keep the deal alive while forcing yearly reviews, dragging negotiations forward year after year. That third option was where pressure lived. From Washington's perspective, it was the perfect squeeze. No immediate collapse, no full withdrawal, just enough uncertainty to freeze investment and slowly wear down the other side. Under normal conditions, that tactic works. Businesses hate uncertainty. Markets punish hesitation. Governments face internal pressure to settle quickly, even if the terms are not ideal. But conditions were no longer normal. Canada had already been operating under pressure for months. Tariffs were not theoretical anymore. They were real, expensive, and ongoing. Steel, aluminum, autos, copper, lumber. Each announcement was framed as leverage. Each one was supposed to push Ottawa closer to concessions. Instead, something unexpected happened. Canadian firms began restructuring faster than anticipated, not out of optimism, but necessity. Supply chains were redesigned, contracts were rewritten, risk models changed. European demand, especially in clean energy and advanced manufacturing, started filling gaps. Asian markets offered scale without the same political volatility. Defense-related industries found new, long-term opportunities abroad. This did not eliminate pain, but it redistributed it. And that redistribution mattered, because when pressure is spread out, it loses its ability to force panic. By the time review talks officially opened, Canada was no longer negotiating only to protect the present. It was negotiating to protect a future it had already started building. At Dylan News, we've been tracking one key factor that many missed: domestic stability. While American politics grew louder and more fractured, Canada's internal position hardened. Support for protecting core sectors increased, not decreased. Any move seen as surrender would have carried heavy political cost. That reality changed the math. Threats aimed at politically sensitive industries stopped being effective tools. They became political shields instead. The longer pressure stayed in place, the easier it became for Canadian leaders to argue that standing firm was not only necessary, but expected. Meanwhile, across the border, the environment was moving in the opposite direction. Approval numbers remained weak. Economic messaging struggled to regain trust. And the closer the midterms came, the more divided priorities became. Some lawmakers began distancing themselves. Others quietly signaled they were done defending trade policies that were no longer popular back home. This mattered more than any tariff percentage, because leverage depends on unity, and unity was fading. The calendar was now working against Washington. Every unresolved week brought negotiations closer to election season. Every unresolved week increased scrutiny. Every unresolved week raised the risk that political control could shift, and if control shifted, enforcement power shifted with it. Canada understood this timeline clearly. There was no rush. Reasonable offers were made. Dialogue stayed open, but red lines did not move. Behind the scenes, diversification continued. Budgets reflected long-term thinking. Infrastructure plans assumed prolonged uncertainty, not quick relief. This was not defiance for show. It was preparation for endurance. Another critical misread became obvious during this phase: the assumption that American protectionism was temporary. Even if political leadership changed, the broader trend was already locked in. Voters across parties had grown skeptical of unrestricted trade. Economic nationalism was no longer fringe, it was mainstream. Canada adjusted to that reality. The goal was no longer a return to the past. It was resilience in a future where pressure cycles repeat. That meant building a system where annual reviews were inconvenient, not dangerous, where negotiations could stretch without forcing bad decisions, where trade talks became discussions, not emergencies. As summer turned to fall, the contrast was clear. One side was negotiating while watching polls. The other was negotiating while watching long-term trade flows. One side needed quick wins, the other could afford to wait. And in geopolitics, patience often becomes power. The coming election would decide more than seats. It would decide how much leverage remained on the table, and Canada was ready for either outcome. By the time autumn approached, the political atmosphere in the United States had become impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a trade debate, it was an election environment. Historical patterns were starting to reappear. Incumbent governments under economic pressure rarely escape midterms without losses, and this time the warning signs were flashing early. Forecasting models began pointing toward real shifts in congressional balance, not dramatic landslides, but enough movement to change how power was exercised, enough to bring oversight back into the conversation. For trade policy, that changes everything. Tariffs that once moved quickly now faced questions. Authority that once went unchallenged started attracting legal attention. And businesses, already frustrated, began pushing harder for stability. From Canada's perspective, this was not something to celebrate or fear. It was something to factor in. Because regardless of who gained seats, the negotiating environment was about to change. Either a new majority would seek quick resolutions to calm markets, or a weakened leadership would struggle to maintain pressure. Both scenarios reduced risk for Ottawa. This is why the waiting mattered. Canada had already done the hard work. It had absorbed initial shocks. It had redirected exports. It had funded alternatives. So when uncertainty increased, the cost of patience dropped. One of the most misunderstood elements of this phase was domestic politics inside Canada itself. Observers expected fatigue. They expected pressure from farmers, manufacturers, and exporters to force compromise. What happened was the opposite. Support for defending supply-managed sectors strengthened. These were no longer framed as outdated protections. They were framed as safeguards. Any government seen backing away from them would have faced immediate backlash. That made them immovable, and in negotiations, immovable positions can be powerful. Washington's playbook relied on discomfort translating into pressure, but discomfort had already been priced in. By now, Canadian businesses were planning under the assumption that uncertainty was permanent, and when permanence replaces hope, behavior changes. Investments moved toward Europe and Asia. Partnerships became multi-year instead of temporary. Risk was diversified deliberately. At Dylan News, we always say this: real leverage is built before negotiations start, not during them. That lesson became clearer as talks dragged on. Every extension, every unresolved issue, every delayed outcome, none of it triggered panic in Ottawa. Instead, time became a quiet ally. Now, quick pause here. If you want clear breakdowns like this, without noise, without shouting, and without surface-level drama, make sure you're subscribed to Dylan News. We cover what actually shapes outcomes, not just what trends for a day. Back to the story. As election season intensified, messaging shifted, economic protection remained popular, but execution faced scrutiny. Businesses wanted relief, voters wanted results. This squeezed negotiators from both ends, and that squeeze created space for compromise, space for recalibration, space for Canada to maintain its core positions without escalating conflict. What mattered most was not who won the next vote. It was that the era of easy pressure was ending. Canada no longer needed assurances. It had already built options. That reality cannot be undone quickly. Supply chains do not snap back overnight. Trade routes once established tend to last. Even a complete policy reversal would not erase the changes already underway. This is where many analysts got it wrong. They assumed diversification was a temporary hedge. In reality, it had become a structural shift. Canada was no longer reacting to American politics, it was insulating itself from them, and that changes the future of every negotiation to come. As winter approached, the outcome was still unresolved, but the direction was clear. Canada had gained something more valuable than concessions. It had gained time, flexibility, and independence. And in global trade, those are the currencies that matter most. As the year moved toward its final stretch, one truth became impossible to deny. Regardless of how negotiations ended on paper, the relationship had already changed. This was no longer a system where pressure alone could dictate outcomes. The balance had shifted. Even if political power in Washington changed hands, the deeper trend remained intact. Protectionism was no longer tied to one leader or one party. It had become part of the landscape. That reality forced a different kind of planning. Canada stopped waiting for stability from outside. It started building it internally. Budgets reflected that shift. Trade missions were no longer symbolic. Infrastructure spending assumed long-term diversification, not short-term relief. This was not about abandoning the American market. It was about removing vulnerability. A country that depends too heavily on one partner always negotiates from fear. A country with options negotiates from choice. That difference defines outcomes. Looking back, the irony is hard to miss. Policies meant to tighten control ended up accelerating independence. Pressure designed to force alignment triggered adaptation instead, and chaos created the conditions for long overdue change. Historians may debate motives years from now, but effects are already visible. Canadian firms now operate with wider horizons. Trade planners assume volatility as normal. Negotiators enter talks knowing that delay is no longer dangerous. This does not mean conflict disappears. It means conflict loses its ability to dominate. The next generation of trade talks will look different, less emotional, more calculated, more balanced, and that balance did not come from victory at the table. It came from preparation away from it. What unfolded during this period was not a single decision, it was a sequence, a refusal to rush, a willingness to absorb discomfort, an understanding that sovereignty is built, not declared. When future negotiations begin, Canada will not arrive as a supplicant hoping for exemptions. It will arrive as a partner with alternatives. That is the real outcome of this moment. The calendar may mark elections and review dates, but beneath those markers lies something far more lasting, a system reshaped, a dependency reduced, a country repositioned, and that repositioning will continue to influence North American trade long after today's headlines fade. This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a different one. And as always, Dylan News will be here to break it down, clearly, calmly, and without noise.